I've been a part of panels for a long time in this business, and I have never seen a more qualified group of people on one panel ever in this industry. You guys should all be really thankful that you have all these people here today.
Well, you brought up touring, and you have Jack Ross right beside you, so I'm going to talk to Jack. Jack, you and I have had many discussions. You represent one of my acts. You've represented other acts of mine over the years. We've known each other for more years than either one of us want to admit. Does CanCon work in your world?
Absolutely. I've been doing this a little over 20 years, and when CanCon came in, thanks to people like Bernie and his peer group and the work that they did to with the federal government to bring the CanCon regulations forward, it meant I think it's the reason that we're probably all in this room, quite frankly. We have I believe the Canadian music business, in a lot of ways, is the envy of the world. We have tremendous support, both from private industry and from the Canadian public through the government funding. And CanCon is the first building block for all of it. As far as I know from what I've read, because I was only 8 or 9 or 10 years old when those fights were happening, there really wasn't much of a domestic music business, and we have a strong, vital business. And there's I marvel on a weekly basis just the amount of money that Canadian artists are taking out of the Canadian economy on a touring level, in the business that we do and that the other agencies do on behalf of our clients. It's truly amazing how such a huge part of Canadian culture. And it wasn't that long ago, I believe, 10, 20 years ago, when people didn't know what Canadian culture was. And there was questions in the media all the time. Oh, Canada doesn't have a culture. What does it mean? There isn't a Canadian culture. There isn't a Canadian identity. And Canadian music is, I really think, at the heart of the movement of a very strong Canadian identity that's developed, and that goes back to CanCon.
I just wanted to add to that, because I remember a time at my campus interviewing artists who thought that it would be a career-moving move to name a Canadian place name in a song and mention they were from here. They sort of, whitewashed their songs to make sure that there was an opportunity in the American market. I don't sense that at all now. So, the pride that's here is a result of a lot of the legislation that's gone, and not to mention the incredible creativity and joy in celebrating great music that is here.
Just on an economic level as well.
Now we're happening. But this is good. On the economic level, not only on the live business, but for an artist's career in being able to span the globe, Canadian content. You have to remember, Canadian content rules were not limited to this is how much Canadian music a broadcaster will play. It was really about helping, in part, build an infrastructure for an industry, which I think you can look at, as Jack said, the number of people sitting up here and the number of people employed in the music business and music industry and all aspects of that across this country. That was because there was an infrastructure built. And what the Canadian content regulations for broadcasters did was it allowed Canadians to hear their own stories, to hear their own voice on what are essentially public airwaves. So you hear that voice, the band, the artist gets played on the radio, they go out on the road, there's an audience in those communities across Canada waiting for them to come to their community. Makes Jack's job pretty important, where he can sit down with a club owner or a theater owner and say, look, I've got this number of spins on Canadian radio. As a result, the band's selling records, they've got a tour base. This is what the ticket price is going to be, my friend. So for an if we remove it all from the warm and fuzzy feelings we all get about being able to hear our own voices on the radio, it was a startling economic leg up to a fledgling industry.
We need to get the mic over to Bernie, because I think, Bernie, you were in the forefront of some of that. Maybe I'm wrong, but why don't we talk about, you are, and this is no disrespect whatsoever, because I have the most respect for you. You've been doing this a while, and you did the original 360 deal back in 1964. So why don't you talk about what, where that's coming in terms of Canadian content, how you've seen the change?
Well, first off, I started my label True North in 1969, so it predated the Canadian content regulations. I don't want to take too much time, but I just did some research. I think in 1970, 2% of the music played in Canada was Canadian. So something had to be done. There had to be changes. And it wasn't entirely radio's fault entirely. It was a part of the culture. It was the way Canadians thought and the way they viewed themselves to some degree. Anyway, as soon as the Canadian content regulations came in, the industry, as Steve has pointed out, started to boom. And they were very smart regulations because they cost really the taxpayer nothing. It did cost some administration headaches to radio, and that should be acknowledged. They had to all of a sudden keep track of what they were doing, but essentially it was just an admin cost. But they cleverly, in those regulations, when I say they, I'd like to think I had some small part in that, we made sure that part of the qualification was that the records would qualify if they were produced in Canada. And as soon as that notion became part of the regulation, there was a reason for people to start building recording studios, and there was a reason for people to start staying in Canada. And it only took a few years. I mean, I would say by, we started our label in 1969. I know it's a different era, and some of this may not even be all that relevant, but we put out our first record, and by the time we put out our fourth record, we started getting gold records. And a lot of it had to do with airplay. We didn't even think we were making commercial records, to be truthful.
What was gold back then?
Say 50,000.
No, it's 40 now.
Oh, okay, well, 50,000. And platinum was 100,000. And by the time I sold my label, we put out 500 records, over 500. And we'd have over 51 gold and platinum records. But to quantify the differences is almost impossible for somebody, for me anyway. But what I can say is that the Canadian content regulations were, I think, the single most important thing that happened in Canadian music. It takes, of course, the most important thing is the musicians who make great music. But that regulation was the most important thing. Later on in the equation, what many of us started to understand, including radio, because we worked very, very close with radio. I mean, there was always battles amongst us, but it was also a very close and cooperative situation when you sort of got away from the backroom struggles. And what we all started to realize was, well, we had this great Canadian content regulation, but we weren't necessarily making as many records, and the companies weren't necessarily as strong as they could be. And out of that came the beginnings of organizations like Factor and Video Fact, later Star Maker, the Met program in Heritage, and various other things. So it was a terrifically
So
important thing.
you would say that, because I was just going to ask that question, that Canadian content beget Factor, because at that point there was a need, and I think, Chris, would you say, I don't know if you were there at the time, but would you say that part of your complaint when you had to play more or chose to play more Canadian music was that, well, we need more, can you give us more? And then, so then the Factor was created as a result of that? Was the evolution of it?
Yes, it's part of it.